Hello everyone and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. Last time, we talked about atheists, and I detailed what I thought the best argument for belief in atheism was. In the wake of that podcast episode, I had some interactions with folks on Twitter about the episode, and one of the things that came up was agnostics and how there's a difference there. So I wanted to take some time today to detail some of those differences and address that other group, agnostics. So like I mentioned earlier, I had some discussions and questions with folks about who the last episode was addressing. And I think some people assumed that I was speaking to both atheists and agnostics. Many of the arguments that were detailed only applied to specifically atheists, and that was intentional. But I do think that addressing the agnostic side of things is something worth exploring. So I wanted to detail my thoughts on agnostics here today, and I think before we do that, we should start with a clear definition and delineation between atheists and agnostics. First off, atheist is defined as a person who does not believe in the existence of a god or any gods, one who subscribes to or advocates for atheism. So, they definitively believe that there is no God. They do not believe in the existence of a god or of gods. Contrast that with somebody who is agnostic, and there are actually two definitions for that. One of which was used by somebody in the Twitter thread, and I was using a different definition, but we were both right because there are two definitions for this that both apply. So the first is a person who holds the view that any ultimate reality, such as God, is unknown and probably unknowable. The second definition is a person who is unwilling to commit to an opinion about something. One of the people who I was discussing this with was using the first definition, whereas I was using the second. For the nature of this conversation, I'm going to be primarily talking about the second definition here, because I think that's a category that more people fall into, A, and B, I think that it's almost impossible to prove, if not impossible to prove, the first statement definitively false.
What first statement?
Person who holds the view that any ultimate reality is unknown and probably unknowable.
Oh, that first definition of agnostic. Like, by that definition, you can almost say everyone falls into that, probably, right? Does anyone believe you can prove the existence of God or disprove the existence of God?
I think there are some people who do and actually fervently hold that belief, but I think that most people think that there's some degree of ambiguity, and this is the faith that most religions profess, and that I would argue is even necessary for atheism.
Right. So I'm just saying, like, in the context of what we're talking about with different worldviews when it comes to, like, a religious stance on something, that definition is not necessarily helpful in this context, because for the most part, I don't think any religious worldview claims that you can prove that with 100% certainty, right? In which case, everything is agnosticism based on that definition.
Yeah, I mean, on this side of heaven, I guess there's a decent argument to be made there.
Right. That's why I'm just saying, I'm just trying to justify why, like, maybe put crudely, we're kind of throwing out that definition, because I don't think that's useful for this conversation.
Well, and I think, well, yeah, I think that's a great justification. I'd also reiterate one of the previous things I said, which is I think most people fall into that second category. Or I think most people who call themselves agnostics fall into that second category.
Which says what again?
Which says a person who is unwilling to commit to an opinion about something.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's always how I viewed the difference between atheism and agnosticism. Is atheism is essentially saying not just I don't believe in God, but that I actively believe God does not exist.
Yeah.
Versus agnosticism is just like I don't know.
Yeah, and then theism is God
God
does
does
exist.
exist, right?
So on one side you have atheism, God does not exist. On the other side you have theism, God does exist. And agnosticism or agnostics are in the middle saying, I don't know right now.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this kind of started because the title of the previous episode was like best argument for belief in atheism. And someone was
Yeah.
making the claim that atheism is not a belief, it's a lack of belief.
Yeah, so what I would contend is both poles there, atheism or theism, belief or unbelief in something is still, like, this is kind of paradoxical, but like it's still a belief. If I do not believe that unicorns exist, then I actively believe that unicorns do not exist. It's just a matter of semantics.
Right.
Now, you could say, oh, I have no belief about unicorns existing or not, if you actually fervently held the belief, or if you actually fervently were unsure about the existence of unicorns.
Right. Like you weren't making a stance one way or the other.
Yeah. So, for instance, like, I think maybe a position that I'm in is, like, I don't really know if aliens exist or not. I'm kind of in the middle on that. I see a couple decent arguments on both sides for yes, they do, or no, they don't exist.
So you're an alien agnostic is what you're saying.
Sure.
That's what I'm hearing.
Sure.
Okay. But what you're saying is even saying I believe aliens exist, like saying the statement I believe aliens do exist, like the flip side to that, saying I believe that they don't exist, is not just lack of belief. It is still an active statement of saying they don't exist. It depends on how you're kind of framing it, I guess.
Yeah.
But sometimes I have heard agnostics say like, or agnostics / atheists, I guess sometimes even the people themselves kind of blur the lines in my mind between what the difference is, but say that like, oh, it's not that I actively don't believe, it's just like I haven't seen evidence that would convince me to believe that.
Well, I mean, you can also think about this as a bit of a continuum, right? Where on one side you're 100% confident that God exists, on the other side you're 100% confident that God does not exist. And in the middle, you're kind of 50-50.
Right.
Some people are going to fall somewhere on that scale. If you're 50-50, then that's agnostic, and we can kind of define where those cutoff points are, right? If you're 80% sure that God exists, does that make you a theist? And I mean, it's really going to kind of come down to what somebody is or is not willing to profess for their belief. I don't know that you can. Percentages are an objective measure for that, and we're talking about something highly subjective, so I think it's more apt to just say there are those three categories.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of, like, that's the assumption that we're using when we're defining these terms here for the purposes of this conversation, right? Like, you can come in, and if you want to say that you think those terms should be defined slightly differently, that's fine, but I think the disclaimer is that's how we're defining those terms for the purposes of this conversation, right?
Yeah, so we're speaking of those three categories being atheists, theists, and agnostics. We are focusing this episode now on those who are in that middle category, agnostics.
And the previous one was specifically to atheists, not to agnostics.
Correct. Yeah. So now that we've defined what we mean by agnostics, from what I've observed, I think that category agnostics boils down to, or can be split up into, two different subcategories. One of these subcategories, I personally have what I would describe as a deep level of respect for those people, maybe a degree of sympathy and admiration for them. And then the other category is almost exactly the opposite, which is that I don't really have any admiration for them, and I think that it can be kind of cowardly.
For them, or like for that belief set, you mean?
For that subcategory of agnostics. So let's detail what these two categories are. The first category, or the first group of people, I would characterize and maybe name this category as, quote, new agnostics, unquote. These are people that are pretty new to their psychological, theological, philosophical journey. They're people who are still in kind of like the discovering phase of things, and they're saying that they don't know because they've not yet had, you know, like the time to think about things fully. They've not yet had the time to gather information together and then to make an informed decision.
To fully refine their thoughts on the matter, right?
Yeah. And, you know, this timeline isn't necessarily tied to like a specific age in someone's life, but let's set an age in an example so that I can kind of explain this and make it clear. So let's take, for example, like a 10-year-old, okay? Most 10-year-olds know very little about theology, psychology, philosophy, and things like this to be able to make a decision for themselves, like the average 10-year-old. They're often heavily influenced by parents, by their upbringing, and they've not yet had the time to see a bunch of different perspectives.
Right, they probably just kind of follow or believe whatever it is they've been taught by their parents at that point.
Yeah, and that's in part because there's just so much to learn, and they're very early on in that process. They've not yet built up to some of these more complicated topics, generally speaking, and had the time to analyze it, because this kid's only 10.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this kid doesn't even know who they are yet. And this is kind of evident, psychologically speaking, as many in their teenage years will form like groups and cliques and gangs in an attempt to fit in. And my understanding is that they're working to fit in because they don't yet know who they are yet. They're putting on kind of like different outfits, literally and metaphorically. They're putting on different ideologies, looks, modes of being, things like that, just like they do with clothes, to try and figure out what does and doesn't work for them. They're embodying certain beliefs or actions, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. You could contend that they're believing different things in an attempt to determine whether or not long-term they're going to believe that thing. And I think for somebody who's at this stage of life, if they were to say that they were agnostic, or that they didn't know about the existence or lack thereof of God, this would be totally understandable, right? Because they don't have that much information. And because they don't have that much information, I would contend that in the lack of information, saying that, well, I don't know, is actually a humble and wise thing for one to do. I think it shows a sense of humility because the person is recognizing that they know very little. So I want to generalize this a little more because it doesn't just apply to 10-year-olds, right? This can apply to those who are just reaching maturity as well. Because you could grow up in a very sheltered home, and this could come later in life, later than 10 years old, if you came to understand and came to be exposed to different ideas at that later point in life.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's journey is different in that sense.
Yeah, but no matter what, whether it's an age thing because you haven't yet had the time, or it's an information thing because you've not yet been presented with different modes of being, different ideologies, different belief sets, I think for the sake of efficiency, I dub these people new agnostics because they're new to these concepts. And as a result, I have respect for them because I think it's humble and wise to recognize their own ignorance.
So that's what the one category is, the new agnostics. The other one, old agnostics? Is this reflective of new and old atheism?
Well, I don't know that it's reflective of new and old atheism, but yeah, to your point, the term new agnostics kind of implies some old. Kind of begs that question. So, yeah, the other group I would probably dub old agnostics. And, this is kind of intentional because I think it's fine to not know something critical and virtuous and to admit that. However, I think it's not good and I think it's not virtuous to be aware of like a lack of knowledge that you have and then do nothing about it. And this doesn't necessarily just apply to elements of faith. It can also apply to practical things. So, for instance, let's say that you're having a discussion with a friend. One of the big hot button issues in your town is there's going to be a vote on whether or not, let's say, a nuclear power plant is going to be built in your city. And the person starts off by saying, well, I don't really know much about nuclear, but I really don't want that in my backyard. Okay? And you say to them, well, let me try and explain to you my position and why I think that actually it's fine. I think it's great. And I think you should support it. And your friend says, well, I don't really have a lot of information. This is something that's going to affect your friend's life and requires a decision to be made by your friend because they're either going to vote for or against this thing.
Or just not vote.
Sure, they could just not vote. Yeah. But then I think not voting is an action as well. But that's kind of a topic for a different time, I guess. The point is, the person is being presented with something. It does affect their life. And whether they do or do not vote, the outcome will affect their life, let's say, because the thing will or will not get built. It's a binary about whether the plant will get built in the city or it will not. And this person, it may be fine for them to not know their thoughts on nuclear energy and how it would have an effect on the city by being there until you're presented with that situation and until you begin to care about it. So let's say that they were initially going to vote against it, right? They said something like, I don't really know, I don't want it here. Mm-hmm. And you said, well, I think that it would be really great to have here. I think that you should do some research on it and look into it, okay? And if they legitimately didn't know, but their default was just, no, I don't want that there, I think that that's really dumb for them to not investigate further because it's something that affects their life. And I make the caveat that it needs to be something to affect one's life because there are plenty of things that I don't have, because there are plenty of things that I don't think that people need to have specific takes on if it doesn't have a big effect on someone's life. So for instance, like the alien thing. I don't think that people need to be terribly informed about arguments for or against the existence of aliens because what does that affect? And the answer is for almost everyone, nothing at all. So having a firm, well-argued, well-researched, logical stance on aliens is not really relevant. It doesn't really matter. Having a firm, well-researched stance on nuclear energy when there's a nuclear power plant proposed in your city that you're voting on, I think does matter. So to bring this back to our discussion about agnostics, I think too often people continue to be agnostic well past the kind of quote-unquote new agnostic phase. I think old agnostics kind of get comfortable dubbing themselves agnostic because it's relatively uncontroversial. If they were to commit to a traditional religion or decide to be atheists, that would require actually like taking a stand and defending a position, like we outlined earlier. It kind of puts them in contention with some other viewpoint, and sometimes with other people too. And as a result, this old agnostic belief, I think, seems like a cop-out to be agreeable and to avoid conflict. So I have more respect for someone who respectfully asserts and defends what they believe in, who actually thinks about things and presents arguments, than someone that chooses to remain ignorant. Oftentimes it seems like these people are rejecting a conviction to appease other people, whether one way or another. I said earlier that these people appear to choose to be ignorant, and I think that that's the best way of characterizing those who I have dubbed kind of quote-unquote old agnostics. I think if you wanted to go to kind of an extreme position, you could say it almost seems spineless or cowardly to intentionally not assert yourself and to make a choice.
Okay, but do you think that someone could reasonably take the position of, I don't know, I don't care, and it doesn't matter to me because it doesn't affect me? Kind of like the stance with aliens, like, it doesn't affect me, I don't care, I don't need to have a stance on it. Is that reasonable with this topic?
Well, so I think that's probably a pretty common objection. I think there are a few common objections. That's one of them. So you're saying the person's objection goes something like, well, I'm agnostic and don't look into things and think about it because it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I'm saying is that a fair retort in your mind?
So that's a good question, and one of the things that came up on that Twitter thread, which I found interesting because obviously as a theist I have one view of things, but I was not confident that maybe an atheist would share a similar view. So my view, and one that I found, interestingly enough, atheists, at least the few that I was speaking to, agreed with me on, was that this is kind of a bad take in my opinion. I see this as being kind of a thinly veiled attempt at cowardice, or being unwilling to stand for a position. Like every single religious person, whether Jew or Muslim, Christian or Buddhist, Scientologist or atheist, like all of these believe that it's an important question that's worth answering. And I think that all of them are right, at least on this topic. Because this choice determines and informs how one lives their life and how we perceive the world. Religion, whether it's traditional or modern, determines what we hold at the top of our decision hierarchy. It informs everything from, like day-to-day decisions and interactions to like even morality, what we view as right and wrong. And to assert that this is something that just doesn't matter seems unbelievably foolish to me. And I think I'm backed by the majority of people throughout all of time. Again, whether theist or atheist or any religion. You brought up one characterization or retort that folks in that second group, in the old agnostic group, bring up. I think another one that they might say is something along the lines of, well, there are so many complicated things that it's too difficult to tell. You just can't figure it out. Okay? And I guess my response to that would be a quote from Negan from The Walking Dead. It says, because you're laughing because we reference this a lot. But the quote is, not making a decision is a big decision.
I think he actually says is a very big decision. But yeah.
Well, in the show, it's both have potentially very negative outcomes. But I think that it illustrates something really well, which is that you can't remain still on a moving sidewalk. Even if you don't choose, life continues to happen. And I say this because belief is made manifest in action. We talked about this in the last episode. One cannot stop acting. You continue to live life. It continues to move on. And I think that new agnostics are in this position for a comparatively short period of time, right? It's like temporarily halting on a moving sidewalk. You may not yet be able to tell that you've moved because you've stayed halted for such a short period of time. But if you gave it enough time, the drift of life or the nature of this moving sidewalk will become evident.
So the second group of agnostics then, that's the one that you're saying you don't really see value or validity in that belief set, or what, like you don't have maybe intellectual respect for people who perpetually sit there?
Yeah, and I think it's unbelievably naive to just sit here and think like, oh well, I can sit still on this moving train, on this moving sidewalk and not be moving. And I just don't really have respect for holding that position long term. I think that we kind of illustrated, or I argued that it matters, and there's obviously leeway in that first group of being a new agnostic. There's leeway for you to be able to gather information and to understand things better. But at some point, I'm saying a decision does need to be made. You know, kind of makes me think about one of the things I say to you all the time when you get kind of, like, I think the phrase is analysis paralysis, where you struggle to make a decision.
So like every day.
With you, yes. But I'll say either the Negan quote, not making a decision is a big decision, or sometimes I'll say, and I'm referencing the story of Sully landing the plane in the river in New York. And one of the things that really stuck out to me when I heard that story and got an understanding of it is that he kept reiterating that him and his co-pilot continued to make decisions. And sometimes life is about continuing to make decisions, continuing to put one foot in front of another and just see where it takes you.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about that than it is about finding the exact perfect next step. And I think in this situation with something where it affects so much of your life, and you can't just put all of that on hold, I think you continue to make some decision no matter what. And people that say, oh, well, no, I don't continue to make decisions based on this, or it doesn't affect me, I think it's just unbelievably naive. And as a result, I don't really have much respect for it. And the reasons I see for that tend to, in my opinion, boil down to like wishing to appease others, or to not have to like actually assert something. And to me, that's kind of a cowardly take.
Do you think part of the root of this is that maybe it's not clear to people, or perhaps theists have not made it clear how or why or in what way it should affect your life? Like, do we have such a maybe watered down version of like theism or morality or like Christianity today that it's not obvious to people that that kind of thing does affect your life and should result in drastic changes in how you live your life?
I think that both sides could do a better job with detailing the practical implications, or how you put it, how it affects one's life. But I don't think that that is necessarily an excuse.
No, I'm not saying it's an excuse, but I'm just saying if you're sitting here and like say you're surrounded by certain Christians or theists, and you can look at them in their life and say, okay, they say they believe this, but like that doesn't manifest in any notable changes in how they live their life. Like they're not standing out in terms of what they do with their life, the greater purpose they have, how they're living their life. I don't see anything notably different between how any other person does. And therefore, because of that, they don't maybe see the deeper importance or purpose that does come with having a higher calling, say. So could you almost understand people who see that and then conclude it doesn't really matter?
No, so I think you're making an argument for, like, primarily I would say from a theistic view, for standing out and illustrating why one should believe in whatever theistic view you're advocating for. I guess I would take a more generalized approach and just say we should have more discussions on both sides, or just in society in general, where we recognize that fundamental truths about how we live our lives are predicated on, and almost definitionally, religious worldviews. When I say religious, I mean like that which is most fundamental or most true. So it's a more generalized definition, but that's why I'm saying it's definitionally true. Because certain belief sets inform how one lives life. Beliefs like, are people fundamentally good or evil or neutral? Like, these inform how we view life itself. They inform political things, they inform scientific things.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I guess I'm just, maybe the direction I'm taking it is more of a call to action to, like, Christians of, can you blame people who take a look at you and say, it doesn't matter that much, if you're not standing out, living your life different, demonstrating a higher, a better, a more fulfilling way of life?
I mean, I think it's a good call to action. I just don't necessarily think that that is an excuse for agnostics, let's say.
Yeah, I'm not saying it is.
Because having the agnostic view is not saying, oh, I don't agree with your theistic worldview that you're asserting. You're needing to make the argument that it does not matter. And what I'm contending is
having the old agnostic view, right? Saying that it does not matter.
Yeah, the old agnostic view boils down to oftentimes, oh, it doesn't matter, in my opinion. And in the cases where folks say, oh, it doesn't matter, I think that's like definitionally untrue. You could assert a generalized definition for religion as like the tenets that one holds at one's core. And everyone has some semblance of tenets that are held at one's core. Now, there may be some internal contradictions, as there are with many people, if not all, but there's something at the core. There are tenets that like you hold to, that you believe, whether you can articulate them or not. And I think if you're an agnostic, you need to disagree with that. And I think the only way that you can disagree with that is by basically saying, well, I'm not acting. Because to act is to have some perception, and to perceive is to have some value judgment, some hierarchical judgment about the world. Like, I can't even choose between having broccoli and having a cheeseburger for dinner. I can't even perceive that question without a sense of, and I'm speaking in the generalized term for this, but like without some worldview, without some set of tenets, without some religion to help me with that. And I want to reiterate again, because I'm sure that there are plenty of folks who may say that they're atheists. When I'm saying religion, in this sense, I'm talking about the most core fundamental tenets that one holds and how one perceives the world. And religion, via that definition, definitionally matters. You can't do anything without it.
And it's definitionally something everyone has then, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone has something that informs them what they do, how they make decisions, how they live their life.
And I think to say, oh, well, these questions don't matter, is to say, oh, well, the way that I'm perceiving the world, all of my actions, all of these things don't matter. I think it's logically inconsistent.
Okay.
Ultimately, I think we're not going to be able to prove with zero doubt who's right, whether that be atheists or theists on this side of life. Every choice requires some amount of a leap of faith. I think belief is made manifest in action, and no one can stop acting. And as a result, if you fall into that first category we detailed, the new agnostics, I would encourage you to, like we made the argument in the last episode, look into a bunch of different things, get an understanding, explore things. And if you're in that second category, I would urge you to understand that you cannot be still on a moving sidewalk. The current of life continues you forward. And this is not something that is only believed by theists. I've been able to confirm that atheists, at least to some degree, on a general level, agree with me on this as well. So those are my thoughts on agnostics. Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently I've been musing about something that a YouTube comedian that I'll sometimes watch said in a video. He was talking about driving, specifically go-karts, and he said one of the things that you want to do when you're in a race, in his case a go-kart race, is you want to drive like there's no one in front of you. You want to choose your line, not theirs. And I thought this was kind of an interesting thought, because so often we go about life trying to respond best to everything around us, trying to adapt to all of these situations, and maybe sometimes we would do better taking that driving advice, driving like there's no one there, picking your line and moving forward with things. I've been trying to think about that and how that applies to life. There's another thing you want to do when you're racing. They say fast and smooth. Fast and smooth. You don't want to try and just go full throttle insane. You want to have a sense of smooth to your driving. You don't want to make quick movements, because those quick movements can upset the chassis of the car and weight distribution, balance of things, and it can throw you off your line. And I've been thinking about some of those concepts, some of those tenets, and applying them to life. Fast and smooth, pick your line. I think these are things that can be implemented in our everyday lives. You don't want to make a bunch of erratic decisions. You want to have some semblance of a plan, right? You want to pick your line. You don't want to be swayed by the whims of every single political or international event. You want to drive like there's no one in front of you. You want to choose your line, not theirs. Be fast and smooth. But that's what I've been musing about recently. Well, with that, if you have any thoughts on our topics today or other topics you'd like to see us address, please feel free to shoot us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. With that, thank you again, everyone, and have a good night.